Good afternoon and welcome to the session called Public-Private Solutions Sandbox. I am Patsian Loh, Chief of Staff and Policy Director at ADPN, based in our headquarters in Singapore. Our warmest welcome to friends from all over the world, also representing many voices in social impact. Now, some housekeeping and technical announcements before we fully begin. This session is on Zoom. It will be recorded and you will be able to access the recording from conference.adpn.asia. If at any point you get disconnected or have a bad connection with audio or video, try to log out and then log back into the session. For other technical queries, please click on the link provided in the chat box to reach the ADPN Tech Help Desk, and our team will respond as soon as possible. While we will temporarily turn off the chat box after we start the session, do share any questions through the Q&A button located at the bottom panel of the screen. We will also invite you to participate in some polls throughout the session. Although your question may not show up on screen, they will be visible to the moderator and she will raise them for the panelists to answer. Please accept our apologies in advance if we won't get to all the questions should we run out of time. You can also send your questions to us after the session at policy@adpn.asia. For those online that are new to ADPN, let us introduce ADPN to you very briefly. We are a network of funders and resource providers with over 600 members across 32 markets. Our mandate is to move more capital towards impact in Asia by providing social investors like yourselves opportunities to connect, learn, and lead. We also know that life these days revolve around digital platforms, so we do invite all of you to share highlights live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Don't forget to tag us with #ADPN2020. Now, earlier on, our poll had asked about your interest in different public-private solutions like blended financing, SDG-linked instruments, and more. ADPN is glad to bring opportunities for public sector stakeholders to engage social investment as key partners, affecting critical issues like climate change. After the session, we welcome all delegates to visit our policy platform, APFX, which showcases public-private partnership opportunities for social investors, and our climate action platform, which connects social investors with climate action opportunities. You can visit both these platforms from our website. Now, let us begin the session proper. For 5 days now, we have heard throughout the conference from government representatives, impact investors, foundations, companies, financial institutions, and social organizations. What a rich diversity, and that is what makes today's session especially exciting. We will be centering our discussion on a few examples of public sector and investor resources coming together to advance impact in climate change, as well as other key issues. What kind of opportunities and challenges arise when adopting innovative approaches like blended finance? What are the regulators' considerations when rolling out new instruments like green sukuk? How can impact investment partner with infrastructure spending and public funding schemes? And can we apply such public-private solutions to borderless and complex challenges like supporting displaced communities? So today's sandbox discussion invites you to bring up these possibilities and raise innovative ideas to potentially address these questions. We are delighted to introduce our speakers today. Babette Resurrection, Senior Research Fellow from the Stockholm Environment Institute. Olaf Chongrak, Regional Manager for Private Partnerships and Philanthropy, Asia Pacific for UNHCR. Badlisha Bashar, Assistant General Manager from the Securities Commission, Malaysia. Robert Van Zwieten, Managing Director for Asia Pacific, Convergence. And Fakrul Alfa, Team Leader in Business Development Partnership of PT Sarana Multi-Infrastructure. Babette from Stockholm Environment Institute is our moderator today. Babette is an esteemed senior researcher on gender, livelihoods, climate change, adaptation, migration, and natural resource management in Cambodia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. If you look her up in Google, like I did, you will see many publications to her name. So to welcome her expertise in moderating this discussion today, Babette, the floor is now yours. Please do turn on your mic and we welcome you to begin.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Patsian, for that introduction. And warm greetings from the Stockholm Environment Institute. As you all know, I'm Babette, and I specialize in gender, environment, and development research and policy themes. We are based, the SEI Asia Center, we are based in Bangkok, although now still working from home, but continue our work as researchers with a mandate to bridge science with policy. One of our core tasks is to ensure that efforts towards sustainable development lead to equitable and just outcomes, especially in a world increasingly made unequal. We would like to engage with diverse actors, especially the financial and philanthropic sectors. So we have this pleasure to partner with APVN to explore how we can optimize our efforts to ensure that various forms and various portfolios of capital lead to a sustainable, climate resilient, and inclusive set of outcomes in the Asia Pacific. This session is an effort in that direction. Through this session, the Public-Private Solutions Sandbox, our aim is to bring together people like many of you attending this session, public and private sector representatives, to discuss various climate financing models and specific tools, as Patsian mentioned earlier. This interactive session hopes to explore the scalability and highlight challenges of adoption of these different tools, which our panelists will discuss with us this afternoon, and possibly explore and discuss the pivotal role of private and public engagement, especially if these practices and approaches are to be advanced in regions with the most pressing climate action needs. Today, we have presentations from a mix of global, regional, and national actors who will tell us more about their fascinating and creative and innovative tools and strategies. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker. He is Olaf Chongrak, and he is the Regional Manager for Private Partnerships and Philanthropy at the UN Refugee Agency, or what is commonly known as UNHCR. So, Olaf, I would like to invite you to make your presentation.
Thank you very much. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon. A real privilege to be here, and it has been a pleasure to attend the sessions during this week. Kudos, of course, to AVPN and the many partners that made this possible. My name is Olaf Chongrak. I work indeed for the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and particularly focused on the Asian Pacific region. Most of you might know UNHCR. We are the UN agency looks after the many forcibly displaced around the world. There are more than 75 million of them in 130 countries. We are active, and we are reaching about 40 million of them on an annual basis. We are known for the refugee camps, as you see here on screen, but of course we do operate mostly in different settings, urban ones especially as well. Today I've been asked to speak about a solution on climate that we have been working on, but before I dive into the subject, maybe I wanted to highlight why climate at UNHCR. We are not obviously the UN climate agency. The reason is that we are already seeing displacement occurring due to climate change, which basically brings the topic of climate very closer to our core mandate as an organization. The places of conflict, the location, are also the ones most affected by climate change. It exacerbates it. And finally, when people do flee their homes, they often end up in group in a location that was not designed to host as many. Basically, degrading land, burden on national grids, etc., on energy. So as a result, we see that tensions arise between host and refugee communities, which basically is something that we as an organization really want to address. In the last few decades, we have been greening and protecting and reforesting as a consequence to basically keep those tensions in check. And just to give you one ballpark figure, we have been planting, for instance, in Kenya, more than 19 million trees over the years, to give you an idea. This, of course, represents a very huge financial burden for the organization, particularly because all of our contributions to the organization are completely made on a voluntary basis. And when we do invest or when we spend on these kind of green interventions, it basically competes with our life-saving activities, which is a trick. I mean, it's a tricky thing to do for organization. So as a result, we have been thinking about changing the parts of some parts of the organization, how we are financing them. And this is how we come to the topic of innovative financing at UNHCR. So for the last 2 years, we have been looking at how to basically find alternatives to these expenses. And what this means is basically that we have been working with partners, development banks, investors, donors, implementing partners, to basically go and try to find ways to move away from only grant making and basically grant support to also blended finance, to basically go and scale up certain parts of our programs in that way. As a result, we can look at building longer term and higher quality infrastructure, because we don't need to compete with that humanitarian aspect of our expenditures. And we can also, when we do invest in more cost efficient projects, we can go and lower the costs that are freed up, use those lower costs to basically go and invest directly in life-saving interventions for refugees. In addition, we can also invest in more human capacity for host communities. At the moment, we have 18 of such projects in UNHCR, and I'm just going to zoom in on one. Now, before I zoom in specifically, I just want to also highlight, of course, we still have a lot of normal, old-fashioned, let's say, interventions, such as this one, a non-innovative financing project, which is generously funded by the IKEA Foundation, which lights up an entire camp in North Jordan, for instance, at the Syrian border, and is now also plugged into the national grid. This is purely on a grants basis, but as we're moving forward, we're also looking at these more green options, which are more on the innovative financing side. So this example is what we call the Green Fund for diesel to solar conversions. The problems that we're trying to address is really that in UNHCR, we're running diesel generators, for instance, in more than 30 compounds in Africa alone, humanitarian compounds, which basically contributes greatly to greenhouse emissions. Financially, for UNHCR, it's not at all interesting because, of course, diesel is much more expensive in most locations than solar energy. So we've been looking at trying to find an alternative. The Green Fund project is one that actually addresses that. So SIDA, the Swedish Development Agency, has granted a seed money of $4 million, for instance, and we have established an internal revolving fund. So the dollars that have been put into it are basically being continuously utilized in perpetuity to go and try to set up contracts on clean energy as a service for multi-year power purchase agreements. By doing so, we are trying to allocate technical and project risk also to the private sector, where there's much more expertise in this field. And at the same time, we're avoiding the significant upfront capital that we usually would have to put in. And we basically would have to compete with humanitarian funding in itself. The impact, of course, is pretty clear. There's a direct carbon saving of so many tons per compound that we're looking into. But very importantly as well is that there's a significant financial advantage there, because diesel being more expensive, by doing so, we free up a lot of funds that can be used for humanitarian purposes. Also, we're contributing to the national grid, which basically means that the tensions between host communities and refugees are basically being put down. So all of these things are big. Opportunities and challenges for us are of course numerous, but in terms of opportunity, I think that for us, we're in a special position, of course, with the UN. We have guarantees are relatively easily readily available, so that is a plus. Also a plus for us is that we work at such a large scale in so many places that if we are managing to tackle one of these topics, the impact becomes relatively tangible relatively quickly. The difficulty, of course, is when it comes to the geopolitical nature of our work. We work in conflict or post-conflict locations where, you know, the tangibles in place are not always secure in terms of how long are we going to be in place or not. Very openly, transparently, we must say that we have the lack of internal capacity to make these physical tenders clear. And we are looking for the private sector and all of you basically to find help in that. Thank you very much. That was all from my side as an introduction. Thank you. Back to Babette.
Thank you very much, Olaf. And definitely we'll get back to you with a few questions later. Thanks for that presentation. So at this point, I'd like to invite Badshila Basha, who is actually an Assistant General Manager of the Islamic Capital Market Development of the Securities Commission of Malaysia. So from the perspective of Olaf, which was much more of a global program, considering it was the UN, we go to the efforts and strategies of the Securities Commission of Malaysia. So Badshila, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to AVPN for inviting Securities Commission, and kudos to the good work. Good day, good evening everyone. I'll start by saying initiatives such as this, the conference, all contribute positively towards the Paris Agreement Environmental Accord, which aims to reduce the global temperature increase in this year to 2 degrees Celsius. As an introduction, the Securities Commission Malaysia is a self-funded statutory body entrusted with the responsibility to regulate and develop the Malaysian capital market. Our mission is to promote and maintain fair, efficient, secure, and transparent securities and derivatives market, and facilitate the orderly development of an innovative and competitive capital market. Now, I've been asked to share our experience on how the Securities Commission Malaysia has actually played a role in facilitating climate change. And in this case, I was asked to specifically focus on green sukuk. Green sukuk, to put briefly, is a bond or fixed income instrument that complies with the Islamic law. They are basically based on underlying asset transaction. Just put up. Right. Now, if I can is the slide up? So if I can, is the slide up?
No, not yet, Badshila.
Oh, okay. Okay, if maybe AVPN side can actually put up the second slide, but in terms of development of the green bond market globally, the green bond market actually saw a jump of 50% in 2019. And it's actually a record year where 250 billion of green bond was issued, and this was mainly provided by financial institutions and corporate issuers. Maybe on the next slide. And in terms here, so if you can see the top box on the right, those are the, you can see that there's a huge jump of green bonds issued globally. And in terms of sector composition, these were mainly led by companies providing for renewable energy, green building, and transportation projects. And as you look below, you can see that the main composition of countries it's actually led by the United States, China, France, and Germany. So for the Securities Commission Malaysia, we have since 2014 taken initiatives in the area of sustainable and responsible investment, including in the area of green financing. Now, we do not attempt to segregate green financing. Rather, what we did was we put it under the what we call our sustainable and responsible investment sukuk framework. If you go to the next slide. Right. So under the sustainable and responsible Sukuk framework, we actually define what constitutes sustainable and responsible investments and green projects. It's actually with the view to provide clarity to the industry. So you can see from the green portion actually spells out what projects would be eligible to be issued under green Sukuk. So you have, starting from the left, you have renewable energy, energy efficiency, pollution prevention, and I don't have to read the whole thing. But this is also basically consistent with the green bond principles, which is issued by the International Capital Markets Association. For the next slide, please, if you can scroll down. Now, the key component of the framework is actually the utilization of proceeds, where the issuer that is issuing the Sukuk need to spell out that the proceeds will be utilized towards eligible green projects. And secondly, the process for project evaluation and selection, where the issuer has to establish internal processes for evaluation and selection of the eligible SRI projects. And thirdly is the management of proceeds, whereby proceeds allocated for the eligible SI projects are credited to designated account. And they basically need to be tracked to ensure that it's actually used according to what has been spelled out. And lastly is reporting, whereby the issuers are required to report, and they are to establish a website where investors can refer to the developments of the projects and at what stage the Sukuk has been utilized. Now, arising from, if you could scroll to the next slide. So for us, when we actually initiated the SRI Sukuk initiatives and the Green Sukuk initiatives, we actually provided as a way to encourage issuers to take the Green Sukuk route. We actually provided tax incentives. Tax incentives, firstly through tax deduction on the amount of for the issuance cost, and secondly, we also provided a grant scheme whereby issuers can actually claim from the grant for the cost of external review that they have taken. These are also tax exempted. And on the next slide, please. And from the, I mean, if you look back, measuring what the outcome of the framework, 1 year after the framework was actually issued, we had one social Sukuk issued, roughly about 20 million US dollar. And it was only until 2017 when there was the first green Sukuk was issued. And until to date, there has been about rough 4 years, there has been not even 4 years, within a span of 3 years, roughly about US 1 billion worth of green Sukuk has been issued, comprising 9 issuers and comprising a mix of solar, hydro, and green building projects. All were actually under public and private partnership, except for one, which was a private green building. Other developments taken by the Securities Commission was having a sustainable and responsible investment roadmap, and having guidelines on for SRI funds with the intention further sustainable, responsible investment, and including the green Sukuk. If I may speak about the advantage of green sukuk is that basically the advantage of green sukuk as in fixed income is these are normally longer tenure instruments. They can, in the case of the green sukuk, the longest green sukuk was for 20 years instruments. So investors can actually offload to the market if they want to, if they want to cash in. And fourthly, you can lock in the financing cost. And basically, sukuk as in fixed income instruments are actually big ticket financing. In the case of one of the quantum solar, it went up to a value of USD 2 million. So that's amongst the issue. Okay, maybe I'll see the Q&A.
Thank you, Badlisha, for sharing with us this very vital instrument, the green sukuk. Certainly, we will explore further.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So at this point, I would like to invite the audience to a very short poll that Patsian did indicate earlier at the beginning of the session. A poll will be now presented in your screens. Please take just a few minutes to fill out the poll. So if you see the question, what are the challenges that governments face in leveraging private sector financing for climate resilient and adaptation projects? Please choose only 2 answers from the choice of 5. Okay. We will continue with our panelists. At this point, I'd like to introduce and invite Robert van Zwijten. He's Managing Director of Convergence in the Asia Pacific region. Robert, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you so much, Babette. Let me just start my video so that everybody can see me, hopefully.
Yes.
The presentation, would need to go back a little bit at the beginning. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to AVPN for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you for a little while about blended finance. As Babette said, I work for Convergence. I'm the MD for Asia Pacific, just joined March 15, and essentially my job is to mainstream blended finance in Asia Pacific. Next slide, please. Because we're not a household name, let me just very briefly talk to you about what Convergence is. We're the global network for blended finance. We generate blended finance data, intelligence, deal flow through our online matchmaking platform for both investors and those seeking capital to work on and hopefully close on active deals. And we do market acceleration, essentially design funding programs, 2 of which I will share with you before we close this presentation. Next slide, please. So our membership composition, we're essentially a global community of private sector institutional investors, development agencies, development finance institutions, and a good number of very significant foundations, philanthropic investors, all interested in trying to make SDG, Sustainable Development Goal aligned investments to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Next slide, please. So blended finance, if our AVPN friends would just click one more time so we animate the slide, thank you. Blended finance we define as the use of strategic catalytic capital from either public or philanthropic sources to mobilize private sector institutional capital into investment opportunities that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we start at the bottom of the slide, you see the development funding, typically concessional capital, meaning capital that doesn't operate necessarily on market terms and conditions, often below market terms and conditions. And that type of capital whether it's public or philanthropic in origin, tries to mobilize the private sector capital, which definitely does need to invest at market rate, and they come together in a blended finance structure. Next slide, please. So key hallmarks of a blended finance transaction, typically a degree of leverage, and we don't mean debt versus equity, but we mean commercial capital mobilized by the concessional capital, as we just highlighted. Of course, there's always some degree of impact, we would hope. The underlying activity needs to contribute to the sustainable development goals in a frontier or emerging markets, but let it be said, not all parties need to have development intent. Very often the private sector investor doesn't necessarily care so deeply about the development outcomes of the blended finance transaction. And of course, there needs to be some degree of return, if only for sustainability. The private sector investor would want to have commercial level returns, and the concessional investor often is happy with the development outcome and with a degree of a market rate or an approximation of that somewhere below what the private sector institutional investor would want. Next slide, please. So graphically, you'll see here on the x-axis the expected risk and the y-axis the expected return. The blue line is really the available risk-return profiles for private investors. And if you've got a great idea in a project that sits at A, then clearly that risk-return profile is not acceptable just yet for private investors. So again, if you would please click twice to animate the slide. So there are two things you can do then. You can either move A to C, so essentially return enhance the blended finance deal, say by way of providing concessional loans in the capital structure, or we move it from A to B, which is to basically de-risk the blended deal, say by way of a first loss guarantee. Either way, you then become part of the risk return blue line, and you become a lot more acceptable for private investors to participate in your transaction because the risk return profile for them then starts making sense. Next slide, please. And if you once more click, I'll spend some time on the right side, not so much on the left side. On the left side, just to say that the difference really between blended finance and impact investing is that impact investing and investment thesis, blended finance is a structuring approach. And that's most graphically displayed on the right side, where you see various sources from A to philanthropy, impact and social investors, commercial investors, all coming together in a blended finance structure, whether it be a fund, a facility, a bond, or a note. Next slide, please. So we can do blending across many levels. We can do it across a project level, private equity fund level, or investment fund level. We could do it across fund of funds, across facilities. So you see that these levels may be blended, and what they invest in are again at their next level also blended. Next slide, please. And it, of course, can also be deployed across the project lifecycle. So you'll see here, generalizing a little bit, concessional capital may step up in the beginning of a transaction by way of grants or technical assistance to conduct project preparation. It then might provide some early stage equity investments, perhaps with a first loss capital tranche to pay for the next step, legal or the startup costs. Then in the construction, you might have a potentially blended commercial debt/equity investment, and so on, up till the point where in the end, essentially concessional capital has stepped down, it's achieved its development outcomes and some degree of a financial return, and the commercial capital has stepped up and has gotten its risk return profile achieved as well. Next slide, please. So one example would be the FMO sponsored blended finance facility called Climate Investor One. I won't, for the sake of time, go too deeply into it, but you essentially see a combination of a development fund, which is funded by grants, then a construction equity fund, just investing equity, about 800 million, which has 3 tiers: the donor capital as tier 1, which is basically the first loss level, commercial capital tier 2, and tier 3 then has the institutional capital. And besides that, there's a refinancing fund of about $800 million for senior debt. So that's very much how a blended finance facility might look like in practice. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So how do blended finance transactions typically align with the SDGs? Well, of course, goal 17 is paramount because blended finance in and by itself is a partnership. This is very much about private public solutions for climate finance. You'll see climate action goal number 13. Of course, many blended finance transactions hit on multiple SDGs at the same time. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate the importance of blended finance, as we know, there's about a $2.5 trillion current annual investment gap to achieve the SDGs by 2030. If you once more click to animate the slide, really that $2.5 trillion is only 3% of global GDP, only 14% of global annual savings, and a mere 1% of global capital markets. So this is not about capital not being available. I think these days it's also not about capital being willing or not willing to participate. It's really about bringing public-private philanthropic sources of capital together in this new structuring approach that we're hoping to mainstream blended finance. Next slide, please. So we have a very comprehensive historical deals database. We started in 2007. About 140 billion worth of deals have been identified and recorded with all sorts of details. About 530 transactions at this point. About 70 billion of this has been deployed in the energy sector. If you would just click forward, I think my time is running out, and I did want to spend, just click forward again, click forward once more. Yes, I wanted to talk very briefly, just go back one perhaps, on the Indo-Pacific design funding window. I bet this is one of two last slides. So this is an example of design funding where we operate a design funding window with funds provided by Australian DFAT with a proof of concept and feasibility study grants for sustainable, resilient infrastructure with a gender equality overlay. So this is incredibly important for us because this is market acceleration at the purest form, where we're trying to nudge new structures into being that can mobilize private sector capital at scale. And the next slide shows you another funding window, which is the Asian Natural Capital Design Funding Window, sponsored by the RS Group, a large family office in Hong Kong. More or less the same setup, slightly smaller feasibility study, but larger proof of concept grants, really hoping for people to come forward to invest in natural capital. So again, these are really very important market acceleration mechanisms to nudge blended finance forward. Let me just leave it at this for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Yes, it's a fascinating presentation that you shared with us on blended finance. And considering that they actually use a mixed portfolio of capital, I wonder what challenges Convergence actually encounters along the way in realizing blended finance. So I would like at this point to introduce the next speaker, Fakhrul Alfa. Fakhrul is a team leader of business development and strategic partnership in Indonesia, PT Sarana Multi-Infrastruktur of Indonesia. Fakhrul, please, you can start your presentation.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Babette, for the introduction. So good afternoon, everybody. This is our pleasure for to be speakers of this forum. Actually, yeah, maybe you have already familiar with the blended finance because our previous speaker speaks around blended finance, and I would like to focus on what is actually PTSMI is doing so far in the area of blended finance, and what is actually our role to support the blended finance in Indonesia. Maybe there's presentation slide. Yeah, maybe I will start on the yeah. Okay, so to have public-private solutions, I think the government of Indonesia already have a vehicle for doing that. That's why I think in the next slide, PTSMI was established in 2009. We are a state-owned enterprise, 100% owned by the government of Indonesia, our mandate is to support the acceleration of the infrastructure in Indonesia. We are the national strategic partners in channeling grants, soft loan, technical assistance, and capacity building for any infrastructure projects in Indonesia. We also have a kind of product that is unique, which is we can provide lending to the municipalities to accelerate the infrastructure in the regional and also in the local communities. And also we have a product to, creating an innovative and also a unique product that close the gap that the market has. And we also have a 3 business pillar, which is not only financing and investment, but also we have an advisory to help our client to structure the projects. And also we have the project preparation or project development to help the central government preparing the project, and then the project is ready to be tender using the public-private partnership. And on the next slide, this is our vision. We are trying to become the lead catalyst for acceleration of national infrastructure development. We are trying to be the development partners and also sustainability promoter, ecosystem enabler, and also the market maker. Next. On the next slide, in 2018, we are forming what we call it as a blended finance platform. We call it as SDG Indonesia One, which is we transform the needs into the opportunities, because we know that maybe the public sector, they can mobilize private investments, but there is also limitation on the space of the public sectors, and also there is appetite of the private, but they cannot take maybe scalable projects. And how can we combine this support into one single platform? This is the way that SDG Indonesia One was established. So SDG Indonesia One is an integrated platform. We try to maximizing the impact, we try to mitigate the risk, and also we create the leverage. On the next slide, I will present on what is actually the SDG Indonesia One. So this SDG Indonesia One is there is a 4 type of the facilities that we have. So first one is the SDG development facilities, which is intention to get be able to project or SD projects, which maybe they can support in terms of the grant, like our technical assistant, they can be able to join in this category as a development facilities. So in these development facilities, they can be able to support the project that maybe they don't have before the feasibility study, or even the structure is not yet ready. So on this one, the donor or philanthropy has bigger appetite to support. And then the second one, we have a de-risking facilities, where where there is a condition, for example, like the project already have the feasibility study, but maybe there is a higher risk in terms of the projects. So this facility will support to reduce the risk. What is the form of the de-risking? It's like a first loss mechanism, interest subsidy, guarantee premium subsidy. This on the second facilities. The third one is the financing facilities, which is we try to get more commercial banking to join, because we are not trying to do it alone. We have to be together on the partnership. That's why the commercial bank will follow on, also join in this platform in the financing facilities. And the last one is the equity. For example, like maybe the project already running in the brownfield project, they need more investors. That's why in the equity fund, if there is investor would like to invest, so they join here, and then we try to match with the project. So this is the way that SDG Indonesia One works. And then on the next slide, until from 2018, we launched this blended finance platform. Until June 2020, we had already 32 partners with total commitment for around $3 billion US, which you can look at the sectors there. There is a multi-sectors, there is only specific for green, water, health, social infrastructure, and there is also impacts that we have been created from this platform. So with regards to the SDG number 7, number 13, number 12, for example, this is the way that SDG Indonesia One works so far. And I will give one examples of how can we blend the support from donors and also the multilaterals to support the acceleration of the achievement of SDG. In the next slide, there is an examples of how can SDG Indonesia One support vulnerable communities, which is I know that in 2018 there was an earthquake in Palu, Sigi, and Donggala. At that time, we combined the donor fund from Lee Cashing Foundation and Hutchinson Company. They provide us with the $5 million a grant, and then we combine it with the government budget and also public budget, also our financing facility to support the city of Palu. So, for example, there's a hospital. The hospital was damaged, and then the medical equipment was supported by the grant fund from the donors, and the infrastructure there, the hospital was built with the loan facility, which is the concessional facility from SMI to the local government. This is is a very unique implementation, because maybe if there is no combination or blended finance like this, the grant money should be only spending. But because of this blended finance, we can create more scalable, more sustainable project that we can create. I think I will stop here. The next one may be on the discussion. Thank you, Babette.
Thank you so much, Fakrul. Now it's time for our second poll. So my colleagues at from the APVN team will now post on your screens the second poll. So the question is, what are the challenges that governments face in leveraging private sector financing for climate resilient and adaptation projects? Right? Thank you very much for your responses. I would like now to invite all panelists to please turn on their videos or their cameras. There. Okay. So I'd like to pose a question to you. I think the tools and the strategies that you shared with us and that you've introduced are quite fascinating and really have very forward-looking potentials. But I'm sure along the way in creating them, you've encountered a few hiccups or a few challenges, shall we say. Could I start with you, Robert, since you seem to show that you've been able to gather together several sources of capital for a mixed portfolio. Robert, what were some of the challenges you've encountered when, for instance, you've tried to leverage private sector participation? Robert?
Yeah, let me just make two comments in response. First, to declare my bias toward the following, which is that as you work in development finance, you come to the recognition that amidst all the problems that one can identify, actually every development problem already has a solution. There's been so much innovation in both business and cost models, in science and technology, and even now in finance, that many solutions actually can be achieved. Identifying those solutions is not easy. The most difficult part, I find, is to try and scale these solutions and find the right sort of blended finance package to support them. The second comment I'd make specifically on the blended finance, the capital exists, it's able and willing. The finance technology exists. What we often find is that there is a translational gap between the various sources of capital, be it public sector, private sector, philanthropic, and the ultimate beneficiaries to achieve sustainable development goals. To bring these people together, make them basically sing off the same hymn sheet, if you will, and make sure that these interests converge, no pun intended, even with different expectations, motivations, and risk-return expectations.
I see, thank you. So you're saying here, Robert, that we're speaking different languages and therefore they may be a translation problem, if you will, in bringing different types of actors together. I was wondering, for instance, for Fakrul and Badlisha, is this something you also encounter in your collaborative arrangements with, let's say, private sector actors? Fakrul?
Yes, Bebet. What we have experienced so far is we need to have a kind of same language to do the same appetite, because you know, the private investor is really trying to be risk averse, because they are trying to get a higher return on the project. But in the other sense, that the public sector, which is the government, trying to maximize the impact of the project itself. So we as the intermediaries, we try to matchmaking the needs and also the appetite of public sector and private sectors. That's why we can trying to become the intermediaries, and we also trying to innovate by providing a product which is to reduce the risk, which is like a first loss mechanism, in subsidy. This is something that is the language that could be accepted by both government and also private sectors. I think that's the way that maybe the institution organization could accelerate or to answer that kind of concern. Yeah.
That's interesting, Fakrul, this effort to try to really sort of get everybody on the same page. Now, I'd like to turn to Badlisha. You did mention in your presentation that there were a series of incentives that your organization has tried to put in place. How has been the response to this? Badlisha.
Okay, in terms of incentives, is actually has been good because it makes a lot of common sense for them to pursue through the green suku route. So in terms of incentives, it has been good, but it's a question of more of awareness, creating awareness for most of the issues to come on board, because normally they prefer to go through the normal route. But I think to your other questions, in terms of projects, you see these green projects are normally at least in the Asian region, is actually a nascent stage. So green projects tend to attract higher funding costs. So it's so in some cases, besides the tax incentives, the government comes in and intervene by providing by subsidizing costs and providing guarantees. But notwithstanding that, there are still pockets and gaps, and I think we let you find the participation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In fact, I wanted to pursue further, but later on, perhaps there's an opportunity regarding one of your cases, the Telecosang Hydro, but I'll park that for the moment. I'd like to turn to Olaf then, considering I did mention this particular case with the Green Sukuk, but with the case of the UNHCR, I was wondering about the revolving fund project for green energy that you're working on, which have been using seed funds from the Swedish International Development Agency, or SIDA. Would there be scope for scaling this up, since it appears to be quite innovative? And what types of stakeholders are needed to actually sort of make this program much more robust? And how can the private sector become an important player as well? Sorry for bundling all the questions in the interest of time, Olaf.
No, I mean, like, do we want to scale it? Yes, of course, we want to scale it, and yes, we want to also, replicate it also to other fields even. As I said, like, we are working on 18 of these kind of innovative finance projects, and this is just one example of them. But on this particular one, yes, it was a grant from SIDA. That was a certain level for $1 million, and of course, having more of these grants that basically go into these revolving funds will basically enable more of them to be perpetually used, and basically help with converting green to green much faster. So that would basically be something we'll be looking for. In terms of companies that we would be looking for, yes, we're looking at solar energy provision. If they have any, they can contact us, particularly if they are wanting to basically to go into the competitive tenders that will be issued. looking for companies that are particularly well versed on power purchase agreements. We've also been thinking, of course, also on blended finance solutions around this one. But I must say that for now, I mean, on this one was an example that really didn't occur so much, but we're looking at the other ones as well to build that up. Yeah,
right.
sorry.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Olaf, for your response. Now, I would like to turn to some of the questions on our Q&A feed. So I'll take the first question here, and this has got to do with blended finance. And maybe Robert, perhaps, and Fakrul, you can actually respond to this. With blended finance, investments by governments as public funding in commercial entities, do we ever feel the taxpayer is taking the risks? While companies only seek profits. Given public funds is from tax, shouldn't the returns also benefit the taxpayer? Robert, your take.
Yeah, they do, of course. It's just that public sector funding has different return expectations. Returns can be developmental, returns can be financial, or a combination thereof. And I think many taxpayer funded grant making, for example, focuses on what we also essentially do as a blended finance network globally, which is to nudge these platforms and these projects into being and try to mobilize private sector capital into being. So returns do accrue, I think, to the taxpayer, somewhat financially and certainly developmentally in pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Right, thanks. Fakrul?
Yeah, I think in the development countries like Indonesia, there is a limitation on the budget or the public sector's fiscal budget. That's why we have to invite private sector to participate. But again, with regards to the question, actually, it's not sacrificing the taxpayer, because the project will be happening and the project will be benefiting to the taxpayer itself. For example, like the project which is have a higher risk, like renewable energy, for example. But the project will be there, and then the people can enjoy the electricity that is created from the renewable energy. And this is the way I think we, as a public and as a taxpayer, we have to think about that. Yeah, I think that's the answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Fakrul. There's a related question that has been fed to us, again on blended finance, and it is directed also directed to Fakrul also. It does say here, who is usually the lead in the Indonesian context of blended finance?
Yeah, in Indonesia, the president of Indonesia already issued the regulation with regards to the SDGs. And then this is held by the Bappenas, which is the Minister of National Planning. And because SMA is fiscal tools of the government, we are under Minister of Finance. So we are praying as to supporting the financing side, or the the acceleration of the achievement of the SDGs, and the way blended finance to showcase the blended finance. That's why I think we have the flexibility. That's why we can create more innovative product. We can have more flexible structure. And this is, I think, how can we showcase to the world that blended finance already happens in Indonesia? I think that's the answer.
But Lisha, perhaps you can also share your thoughts on this question on the taxpayer from the point of view of the Malaysian government.
Well, I suppose from the economics point of view, you're using taxpayers' money, but those are actually channeled towards, whether subsidizing projects. But, the outcomes of these projects is that ideally they should be more productive and efficient. And so in that sense, taxpayers would enjoy the benefits of the efficiency of the projects. That's my seeing of things.
In terms of the benefits. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Olaf. There's a question here for you. It says, for most governments and investors, climate is a very difficult portfolio from the point of view of refugee relief. What are the reasons to pose to a donor to refugee relief to fund your climate initiative? Olaf.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, refugees is not a type of person or a group or an issue in itself. I mean, it basically is a state in which a person finds himself and basically is a part of humanity. So refugees can be unborn children up till the elderly, and they basically face the same issues as the rest of humanity in that sense. So this is why when they are in nature, when they are faced with climate change, it affects them directly, and particularly when it comes to the tensions between host communities and refugees. So this is why the topic of climate really becomes a very important one. It just as much as it is on climate, as much as it is on conservation. When in Bangladesh there are refugees that enter in the same spaces where there are elephants, for instance, we need to look at basically trying to make sure that this doesn't, exacerbate the situation, and we are going to have to get zoologists and people that are really focused on that as well. When it comes to climate, as I said, like they are located in locations where there is a big issue on climate, and this is why it becomes one of our problems. When there are too many as well in one location that is not designed for it, we are going to have to look into waste disposal, because otherwise, when that is not tackled, it becomes a problem for refugees. So since refugees are a part of humanity and climate change is a human problem, this is how we basically get into it. And it is really not a hard explanation to do for governments and donors alike that this is an issue for everyone. So this is how it comes now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olaf. One last question for anybody who would like to take this up. There's a question from the audience. We mentioned in past sessions the need for access for finance to women and vulnerable groups. Within the industry, how well supported is this, and how well integrated are women in decision-making roles, and what can we do to support this? Any one of the panelists would like to share his idea?
Well, it seems, Babette, other than yourself, we're all male, which is not right, the right panel composition, but let me give it a try. So, gender has come to the fore for many, many years. My personal perspective is that it's been a great topic at conferences, but too little is actually being done. And certainly out of Convergence, we've been taking on a very active role to champion gender equality, gender lens investing. And we're very pleased that DFAT of Australia, for example, has put in that gender lens into its design funding window. Going forward, we get another design funding window that more emphasizes gender specifically, because it needs a lot of work, a lot of attention, but particularly a lot of serious capital to back up all the good intentions in the talk.
I see. Thank you for your intervention, Robert. And at this point, I suppose in the interest of time, we've run out of time. Thank you for a very inquisitive audience, and thank you for all your fascinating presentations, as well as the tools with which you shared with us. Global trends actually tell us there's really a great need to improve access to climate finance that can positively impact a wide range of vulnerable groups and beneficiaries. Our vehicle is through heightened collaboration, such as what we spoke about, and engagements between the private and public and development sectors. The Stockholm Environment Institute, as well as APVN, would certainly be happy to work with you, those of you in the audience and those of you in the panel, in realizing these aspirations. So please stay in touch with us at SEI, as well as with APVN. My colleagues, Niall O'Connor, Center Director of SEI, and Yossi Zahar, also part of SEI, will be happy to take things forward. And thank you all. Have a good afternoon. Thank you for this lively and fruitful conversation. And thank you, APVN team, for being very helpful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Babette.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Our deepest gratitude to Babette, Olaf, Badlisha, Robert, and Fakru. And from the ABPN policy team, which has 3 women, so we hope we do even the gender balance a little bit. We're so excited that from Bangkok, Manila, Jakarta, and Kuala Lumpur, you have all given us a glimpse into how your work is giving impact investors an opportunity to be part of the impact that you do. For the audience, all the presentations that were shared today will be loaded onto our website. So I hope this session has also whetted your appetite for the diverse menu of options in the world of public-private solutions. Next year, we do hope that have seen you leverage innovative approaches like blended finance, like Sukuk, partner with infrastructure and public investments, and invest to mitigate the impact to displaced communities from climate change. We do invite you all to get started by going onto the AVPN connector to connect with our speakers from today. This session is made possible with the kind support of our lead partners, Chandler Foundation, Stockholm Environment Institute, and Eden Prize, and our knowledge partner, Standard Chartered Private Bank. In case you didn't know, there were 233 people that were logged into this session today, and all of you are welcome to join our next sessions. There is one that is going on right now called Driving Sustainable Finance Towards a New Economic Model. It will be finishing in 20 minutes. Or you may join the next session, How to Achieve Impact as an Investor, which will begin at 5 p.m. Singapore time. Finally, to give the AVPN team some encouragement and help us improve, please do take a few moments to fill out our post-conference SurveyMonkey. The link is popping up in the chat box at this time. It will only take you a few clicks, but it will help us go that much further. Thank you all again for your attention and participation. Have a great afternoon.